Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Love First Christians Bible study. This week, we're going to be studying Obadiah. I'm here with Aaron Goss. Aaron, how you doing?
I'm doing very well.
Awesome. We have talked about Obadiah already. Made it about 15 minutes before my mic kicked off and started doing squeaky noises last week. The week before that, stuff came up. So this is our third and final time. If something happens on this one, I'm just pulling the plug on Obadiah. God doesn't want us discussing Obadiah. That's my general conclusion. Sometimes the world gives you signals, and such as it goes. That actually is in line with Obadiah, by the way. Right off the beginning, I think it's interesting that it says God's delivered a message to your enemies, right? Like to go take. We used to think God delivers an enemies, like delivers a message to like a prophet who tells the allies that the enemies are coming. But in this case, God decides to give the message to the enemies, like these Edomites suck, go kill them. So sometimes you just got to listen for the messages wherever they may be. And in this case, God would be delivering a rather interesting message. I'll start off last week because this is going to be my main one. I felt bad for kicking off last week because, gosh, we had a lot of streamers picking up. So I appreciate anybody viewing this, anybody watching. It's very appreciated. I just hope we get the same eyes on it that we got on last week. So right off the bat, Edom is a kingdom. They are not technically Israel. However, they were considered like part of the Hebrew nation when we talk about nationalities. I don't want to get too into the weeds as far as the history goes. But there is kind of an interesting, basically Obadiah predicts the death of the Edomites, and not just the death, but the total annihilation of the kingdom. And indeed, this is historically what happens. There's a lot of nations that like get defeated, but are still around. The Jews are actually a really good example of this one in Israel. But Edom in this case, actually, once it is destroyed, there's no ethnic Edomites. Of course, we kind of have ideas of what the heritage was based on some of their rock structures and buildings, but they are destroyed as a nation and as an ethnic group. Completely. This actually happens during the Bronze Age. One of the Bronze Age collapses. Now, if you love history, I strongly suggest there's a book and a podcast called The Fall of Civilizations. Really fascinating stuff about a lot of these older groups. And the Edomites are actually part of the Bronze Age, one of the Bronze Age collapses. Now, the interesting thing about that compared to the other falls of civilizations, there's a lot more mystery to the Bronze Age collapses because it's several kingdoms that collapse and not just one. And they kind of collapse at roughly the same time. And they actually fall to part of it to a group of people that are called the Sea People. Historically, that's what we called them because we actually don't know almost anything about them. We roughly understand that they were like anarchists, and we roughly understand that they really didn't have, written language, or if they did, they didn't write it on anything that could be preserved. They weren't big on records, didn't really lend themselves to mathematics. Now, we actually know the Sea Peoples from a historical fact because they actually do settle down and they become nations themselves later on. However, at this time, they're nomadic and they're wandering around. And Edom is one of the ones that falls to these kind of very mysterious Sea People. It's actually one of history's greatest mystery, but certainly one of history's greatest mysteries. And this is actually one of the examples of their conquests. Now, they also do get taken out of also by Nebuchadnezzar II as well.
That was what I was going to ask. It seems like that would be the natural endpoint.
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar II goes at him, and then I think Babylon finishes him off. Nabonidus. They suffer from many, and it's much like Egypt actually suffers a Bronze Age collapse during this time. Now they survive, obviously, as we know, to form another civilization, but they struggle. Like they actually are one of the ones that actually turned away the Sea Peoples, but they actually fell because of some internal struggles. I'm getting in the weeds. I knew I would do this. I need to stop myself. Anyway, there are several attackers that come and end up taking advantage of them. Now, prior to this, what happened was Israel was attacked and raided, and Edom stood by and did nothing, despite the fact that they shared their heritage, customs, trade routes, and everything like that. And this is kind of a lesson of what happens when you stand by and watch somebody get destroyed. I told you last week, Aaron, that one of the things that I don't find interesting is necessarily prophecies that have already come true. It's cool. It is cool, like that a prophecy happened and it comes true. But at the same time, it's like, what do I learn from this? The nice part about Obadiah is we can gather a lot of what we learned from this that's still useful today. Is there anything you wanted to say as kind of a setup to Obadiah before we get into some of the more specific verses?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, picking up from where we left off last week, because the point that I was making last week when everything collapsed was that
I went full Edomite.
We were talking, you were actually brought up the fact that a major point in the discussion was that Israel produced a lot of the foodstuffs that would go to the Edomites because they lived up in the mountains and they couldn't cultivate as well. It's harder to grow things in rocky terrain. But in return, the Edomites had a strong military force. And I had taken that point and I was expanding upon it to say it's very similar to how Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. They provide so much of the world's grain stocks. Like a lot of the grain in the world is produced in Ukraine. And the United States is a strong military force that, although we do produce a lot of agricultural goods, we don't produce as much as a lot of other nations. And, we're seeing our neighbors coming under attack, and a lot of people are saying, well, just let them go. It's not our problem.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Now, because this was the arrangement, right? And God, as we know from the Old Testament, is enjoys contracts, right? And the ability to keep your contract as well as you can. Of course, God provides us a way out of them and understands when things aren't fair and when circumstances change. God also loves eclipses in contracts, so I understand why he might not want to get involved in like lasting alliances. But that being said, if you say, I will provide for your defense in exchange for food, those people gave you food. You better give them defense. That was the whole arrangement with the Edomites. Now they lived.
Yeah, we ended up looking it up last week because it was the Budapest Memorandum that we remember. Right. We were like we couldn't think of what it was. I
said Warsaw Pact, and that just shows how much I know about geography. Every week I have to relearn history.
Yeah, we were basically like, okay, so after the fall of the USSR, the Ukraine had nukes. And we were on this big nuclear nonproliferation kick where we trying to denuclearize nations that had fairly unstable governments, because having a nation that had an unstable government is a recipe for disaster when you've got all these nukes floating around. So in exchange for us denuclearizing Ukraine, both the US and Russia were like, yeah, we'll defend you from hostile threats. If you denuclearize, we'll both agree to protect you. And we were joking last week that Russia has done less to hold up that end of the bargain than the United States has. But yeah, no. Keeping it back to Obadiah specifically, because I just find that there's so many ways to draw parallels between what's going on in Obadiah and what's going on in the world today.
Yeah, I think. If we keep it at the national level, that what you said is so true that it's like, yeah, we need to honor these agreements and contracts. It's very unfair. I think everybody looks at what we did with Ukraine. I especially, and I'm even one of the ones that wants out of the war. But when you just say that is extremely unfair that we took away your defenses and then agreed to protect you, and now we kind of go like, oh, protecting you is going to be really hard though. Well, that's either don't sign the agreement or do, right? Like, I mean, and so this is really, I mean, honestly, we should give them their nukes back at this point, right? Like if we're just going to be like, oh, we can't do it anymore here.
I mean,
like,
that would end the war pretty quick.
Right. And I think appropriately, right? Like we went out of the contract, and I think that's maybe the best thing to do, is to just be like, hey, we went out, sorry about that, here's your nukes back, our bad, and then like you said, ends the war. somewhat quickly. But I think also on the personal level, we have these kind of arrangements with so many people in our lives. I look at a lot of people that kind of cut their elderlies loose when their elderlies helped them from so much and they didn't have much. And this is kind of like, we don't say it explicitly, but this is kind of the arrangement, right? Like when you're being raised and you're a baby, you need somebody to take care of you. You can't possibly survive on your own. That you kind of pay it forward when that person who helped you gets later in life and maybe suffers from a little bit of dementia or, starts pooping themselves. I mean, like, when you suffer all the maladies of becoming elderly, would you abandon them and just be like, well, thanks for the help, but see ya, or would you, kind of pay it forward here a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with seniors my entire adult career for the most part. I've worked in multiple retirement communities, and yeah, I can tell you firsthand, a lot of the residents that come through those communities are just dropped off by their family, who never see them, like not even on holidays. They won't come down and see their parents, or if they do, it's only on, like, say, Christmas or something like that. So they haven't seen their adult relative or their senior relative in a year, and then they come in to see how much they've degraded since the last time that they've spoken to them. The dementia's progressed or something like that, and they're like, this is an entirely different person. And I'm like, well, if you spend a little time with them, you'd know. But I mean, the employees of those facilities end up becoming closer family than their actual family. It's pretty sad.
I don't want to get too, just since we're on the subject and Obadiah is so short, I don't mind asking you this question, because I think a lot of times, and I genuinely don't know the answer. I'm calling to your expertise on this one. Like, if I have a family member and I want them taken care of, a lot of times we see these nursing homes just like, well, they're equipped for it. I'm kind of not. Like, I don't know all the medical needs and everything like that. But I assume that there's still that spiritual and familial need there, like to be close to them. And I assume you saw that a lot, it sounds like.
Oh yeah. So a lot of these seniors, they need more of an emotional connection than we're capable of giving. As employees, we can't give them that. We can't be their friend as much as we would want to be, because a lot of these nurses, I mean, the senior living agency bureaucracy, like the company, not just any specific company, but the entire, what's the term I'm looking for?
Take your time. I pulled up
the industry.
Okay.
Yeah, the entire senior living industry runs on extremely razor thin margins. It's the entire industry as a whole generally does not care for the seniors beyond just their ability to draw revenue. I worked for 2 different communities, and from my experience, it's not any different anywhere else that I worked. But I mean, what would you expect as somebody that with no industry experience, that you would pay someone that doesn't have any like medical experience, that is just fresh off the street, but is tending to a senior citizen, doing everything that their adult daily needs are, like changing them and giving them a shower and making sure that they get to and from meals and all that, like all the physical labor and the emotional labor that's involved in that. How much an hour would you pay that person?
So I did work in hospice for a bit. I don't want to make it sound like I have no experience, but I mean, just offhand, because I don't know the answer to the question. I mean, I would pay him $15-$20 an hour, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to vary based off the region and everything like that.
Yeah.
But here in Texas, where I worked in Houston, and then I worked here in like the San Antonio, Austin area. It was $11 an hour. $11 an hour.
I mean, you make more money tearing ticket stubs.
Yeah,
right?
You make more money at McDonald's.
Right.
And you're wiping people's butts and stuff like that. I mean, it's backbreaking work, literally, because you're lifting people. I mean, and a lot of times they'll harp on and on and on about lifting properly, but then they don't really give you the time to lift properly, because you've got to tend to 13, 14 residents on your own. And if you do everything the proper procedure wise, you don't have enough time to do your jobs, and then you end up falling behind and getting reprimanded for that. The turnover rate for our communities was like 400%. You'd end up with like
So that's like a new employee every 3 months.
a new employee every 3 months. We had
Yeah.
a handful of employees that had been there for like a decade, but almost all of our employees were 3 months and then they're out. We would just churn through them like crazy.
Yeah. Well, I imagine between the physical work and the low pay, I mean, it's hard to recommend it to somebody except as a turnover job, unless you appeal to really just their heart. I mean, that,
Yeah.
that,
Yeah, it's very much like teaching in the sense that you just like you're relying on people doing it for the passion of it. And that's how the entire industry is. It's grotesque. And meanwhile, I'm the business office manager. I'm the one handling the books, collecting the rent and everything like that. I'm not getting paid very much for my job, but meanwhile, I'm collecting several $100,000 a month in rent from these residents because they're paying anywhere from like on the low end 2 grand a month to the high end of like 10 grand a month. And the employees are not getting any of that. you know, like it's wild. So I mean, going back to Obadiah and what you ended up bringing up as the topic, like yeah, taking care of seniors is it's a tricky thing because on the one hand, if you're not attentive, and if they're getting old enough that they're not being, you're worried for their safety. A senior living community or a nursing home or something like that is probably the play. But the problem is, it's just unless you're springing for some ultra deluxe thing where you're spending multiple tens of $1,000s a month, for these super fancy places, because there are places like that where they want like a $400,000 deposit before they'll even let you in the community. Like we've got, it's wild, but yeah, people are like selling their houses just to afford a deposit to move into a community. Um, but those places will take care of your family members. But beyond that, they'll subsist in these communities, but they won't live for the most part. And it's
right.
it's pretty sad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and to bring this, I mean, to bring it into Obadiah, and Obadiah actually does make it personal as opposed to just national. He actually compares the nation of Edom to Esau and the nation of Israel to Jacob, appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see what he says is that Esau is committing violence against Jacob. I think that's interesting because we tend to think of violence as like us. If we sit by and watch somebody else do violence, but we don't intervene, we don't think of ourselves as responsible. They used to call these Good Samaritan laws. Those who watched the finale of Seinfeld will remember this. If you decide not to intervene when somebody's in trouble, that you would get in trouble. Now, I know from a legal perspective, we can talk about violence, but we're talking about Christianity and faith. And from that perspective, it actually does count in God's mind as doing violence against your brothers or your neighbors, your loved ones, when you don't step in on somebody's behalf when they're being attacked or harmed. And how often I know, Aaron, you and I share similar circles in the liberty movement. We see this a lot when people come under attack, and we see, of course, the attackers, and the attackers usually get dragged over the coals, and they might get a lot of views, but it's generally negative, right? Like, making them look stupid. But how often do we see kind of the typical people see it and then just kind of go, I'm going to stay out of this one. Like,
Yeah.
I don't feel the need to comment. And if you're not feeling the need to comment when you see, especially people in your circle that you can do something about, like I said, from Obadiah's perspective, God considers you as responsible as them for this violence, right? And it might not be violence, say what it will, like bullying or aggression or whatever words you want to use for whatever you see, bigotry, something like that. And you might say, well, it's not my bigotry, I just didn't say anything. Well, now we can talk about from a legal perspective what you're required to do. That's separate from the conversation. I mean, you and I both being on the anarchist end of the spectrum, we want the law to have very little to do with it. However, this is where spirituality needs to step up and have a lot to do with it. And what we see is from Obadiah, you need to step in and have a lot to do with it. Aaron, I know you have a lot of those kind of stories.
Oh, yeah.
You and I both do, just tons.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to think of any specific thing to bring up right now. Nothing's coming to mind immediately, but um,
Well, I mean, we don't even need to address specifics because
yeah, no,
this doesn't
no,
need to be a liberty group or anything like
yeah,
that. But I mean, and I think everybody has kind of had the situation. I think this is part of becoming spiritually mature, because I think when you're younger and you see a kid getting bullied, the natural reaction is to be like, well, I want to side with the guy who's doing the bullying, right? I want to side with kind of the
the
power guy.
power. Yeah,
I don't want to all of a sudden be on the side of the guy who's getting kicked to the ground, like
because next time it
that's the
might be
losing
me.
side, this is the
Yeah,
winning side. I don't want to be the side of the ridiculed, I want to be on the side of the ridiculer. How often do we talk about debates when we say, oh, that person got owned, destroyed, whatever, like, these terms that have less to do with the ideology and more to do with how we view
the
who was
rhetoric.
the big dog,
Yeah,
who was doing the beating up. Yeah, and I think we need to, as we spiritually become mature, need to realize that our job is to be on the side of these downtrodden, be on the side of the people who are hurt. And when we see people getting injured, that we need to side with them and swallow our pride a little bit and say, maybe it's our friends doing the bullying. It's easy when it's your friends being bullied, but maybe it's your friend doing the bullying, and be able to step in and just be like, hey man, we can't be doing that. That's not our way, and at least intervene on behalf of the person who's getting bullied. And
yeah,
I mean, whether it's bullying, violence, assault, whatever it may be, from a legal perspective, again, we can argue all day, but from a spiritual perspective, it's clear that God holds you accountable. And this is something that ties the Old and the New Testament. I think it's interesting. One of the basic questions is, who is my brother in the Old Testament? You get, who is my neighbor in the New Testament, with similar answers from God. Your everybody, even your enemy, is your brother and your neighbor. And that's how you need to view people. I'm sure Edom they had their own king. Like I said, they were linked to Israel, but they had their own king, and they just felt like, we'll sit this one out. We don't see it as that big a deal. But when you place those degrees of separation, God says, you were linked to them, and you might not honor your end of the bargain, but now, it says in the New Testament, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and God indeed took vengeance on Edom.
yeah, for sure you did.
Let's see here. You mentioned last week, and this is part of it as well, a lot of negativity in Edom against foreigners, right? And it's silly, but this is something that I have seen coming back again in our modern age, that 40% of Americans can trace their lineage to Ellis Island, something like 95% to some kind of immigrant of some kind. We're all so mixed, it's unbelievable. There's nobody's taking a DNA test and getting 100% of anything anymore.
Right.
That's not happening, and it's not going to happen. And yet, despite these people coming from the same seed, when we talk about like family trees, like Esau, Jacob, these are all ethnic Jews, right? Like they share a heritage, they share literal DNA, literal families, but they drew a border in between themselves.
Yep.
And now all of a sudden they get to say, oh, well, we're different. We don't want those foreigners here, and treating Israel as though they are foreigners, despite the similarities between us all. And that's certainly something that we see, you and I, echoing today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely disheartening to see that sort of abject cruelty, and for it to be so pointless. Like if it would be different if we were actively under war or anything like that, and we were having to accept the people who were actively waging war against us and stuff like that. But the people that we're talking about today, they're just, a lot of them are not only not at war with us, they are fleeing the conflicts that are taking place in their country because we caused those conflicts with things like the drug war and everything like that. Their countries are falling apart and destabilized as a result of our nation's influence. And then we turn them away, often violently, when they're just trying to flee the violence that we created. It's so disheartening. Like it's easy to fall into despair over it.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe this is too nail on the head for people politically, but there's a part right in the middle of Obadiah here where he's talking about how you kind of gloated while their nations were falling apart. You know, noted the state of disrepair and laughed at them, and then when the fugitives and survivors came to you for help, you rejected them. You know, you cut them down and just said, you know, oh, they're so much lesser than us, we're so much better than them, without recognizing how much they had gained. I mean, in Edom, it's really obvious, right? They don't have food if it's not for those people that they are currently laughing at. And they just
Yeah.
go like, oh, you got destroyed. Boy, you should have had a military presence, huh? It's like, well, that's what you were
Well,
for, right?
you
Like,
know, and if I could actually poke, because I'm, you know, I think most people who would be watching who know me personally know that I'm pretty leftist. But if I could antagonize a little bit on the left, or the more specifically the liberals, you know, we have a term that we call people who live in the middle of the country that provide all the food, and it's flyover country. You know, and it's very much a smug liberal attitude from the east and west coast to disregard the people that live in the middle of the
sure.
country that provide the food. And I mean, it's definitely worth considering. Not that I think a lot of times that argument gets used as a way of justifying things like the Electoral College, which gives undue influence to people from smaller states and takes away the vote of people from bigger states. When I'm not a fan of that at all, but I do think that it's worthy of consideration to consider the fact that when you smugly disregard people who are the ones providing your food, you're doing yourself a disservice, because that service could be taken away, and then you'd be in a lot of trouble.
Absolutely. And that's exactly it. Like, we're all linked as people. Now in Christianity, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, right? Like that's a given. Like we transcend nations, and we're getting the concept of it. This is one of the things that I love about the whole Bible, is the Old Testament is really paving the way for the New Testament. The more I have read the Old Testament, especially with this, with the love for Christians, the more I have kind of found that like the New Testament was the plan since the beginning. It's just getting things started, and we can see it here that this whole your nation separate from theirs thing was never good, right? Like, it was never and it was never positive. And just how we see it today, I'm glad you bring over like the flyover country, because I don't think this is exclusively against like the immigrants like flooding across the border or whatever. The
Yeah.
what what's the propaganda, the militia aged men, right?
Oh
like
yeah,
like
no, that
like the
drives me
stupid,
crazy.
right?
It's
Like,
like, okay, so you've got men who are like, first of all, these are the same people that are constantly talking about how men are constantly attacked in this, you know, in our country, and how everything's always the feminists are trying to take over everything and everything like that. But then they see a foreigner man, and they're like, this man's a militant. He's probably MS-13, you know, trying to come kill us and everything. I'm like, dude, he
right,
just wants to come and work. He's probably going to send money back to his family. Like, wouldn't you do the same thing if you were in his situation? But they don't. They
right,
can't imagine themselves being in their situation. Like, they were born under the greatest country in God's green earth, you know. And why would they lower themselves mentally to that of a peasant? You know, like it's just such an elitist attitude. Um, yeah,
yeah. This is, yeah, it's a perfect example, because it's exactly what Edom does. They said, we're up here, we're so big and powerful, we're so strong, haha, to all you guys down there. You just tell they don't they don't recognize that link between the two. You know, they don't see that. They, you know, as Americans, when we get all those stuff that doesn't grow here naturally, like bananas, right?
yeah,
But anytime America does something that hurts those banana growing countries, we just kind of, I mean, most people kind of don't know it happens. There's an ignorance there. But a lot of people that do know, unfortunately, are like, who cares? It's Honduras. You know what I mean?
yeah.
It's Costa Rica.
The
It's
only thing that the only time that they ever worry about
Venezuela.
it is if there's like disruption to the supply of a good. Like, I think there was a
Yeah.
it was a fruit, and I can't remember which fruit it was. It wasn't bananas. It was something else. avocados or something like that. A
Are we
couple of
doing
years,
Cuba? Which one are we doing here?
I don't remember off the top of my head what the story
Okay.
was, but there was a couple of years ago that there was a fruit that was in jeopardy as a result of, I think it was a natural disaster, like a hurricane or something like that. And there was a whole bunch of discussion about what is the U.S. going to do to ensure that the American people retain the crop, and not anything to do with like the well-being of the people that are producing it or anything like that. It was all focused on us as like how are we going to maintain our access to this good. And I mean, it presumably, if things had escalated and if it hadn't stabled out and everything like that, the idea would be that the U.S. would militarily go and secure access to a trade good, rather than just letting the free market take over and or anything like that. Because of course the free market doesn't really even exist in this country anymore. But
Oh yeah,
yeah,
yeah. That's it. I think I'm pretty sure everybody's kind of recognized that as at this point. Yeah, that's doesn't exist. Um, yeah, stuff like that, and I think the more we understand economics is really not as complicated as it needs to be. It's really just like the allocation of scarce resources, right? And so, and I know people who've taken economics classes have probably heard that term like way too many times. And it might sound complicated, but really this is just I have stuff. How does it get dispersed? By work, by some person deciding, by a central authority, by families, by whoever occupies the land, like et cetera, et cetera. We've got, and all of economics is just kind of a theory about that kind of thing. It devolves into money a lot because that's how a lot of nations have argued things, to be. But at this time period in history, we're trading stuff. And I think money is a nice veil for stuff, but it's still stuff,
yeah,
and so if we are trading stuff, I don't want to just be like, oh, the money's there. Okay, we're all done. Like, it's over. Um, so the back half of Obadiah, I'll just summarize it as just being that he says exactly what's going to happen. I like the fact that he points out that Israel, the people that you pointed at and laughed at, they're actually going to survive their whole captivity, their dispersal. Like as you laughed while they got destroyed, they're going to live. You're the ones who are going to die, and not just die, but die completely. Your whole nation's going to be nothing anymore. Your whole peoples are going to be nothing anymore. You're going to end up, the ones that survive are going to, mix with other nations, and nobody's going to know who you are.
Yeah.
Whereas, the Hebrews are actually going to, and there's a lot of specifics in Obadiah about what's going to happen. And again, I look at it a lot like Babe Ruth calling a shot. It's cool, but there's not a lot to glean from it. It did happen.
Yeah.
I think it is cool because from a historical perspective, we actually do know that this happened. And we do know that the writing of Obadiah actually occurred before this happened. So it is cool to see it predicted and see it come up. If you are ever interested in this, it's actually one of the ones that's most used when people try to kind of talk about the biblical inspiration of the Bible, because there are very specific elements talking about Negev and Ephraim and Samaria, Canaan, and various things that are going to happen. Ultimately, just know that they happen. But there's one part right before the end that I wanted to make sure we talked about today. And so the day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. And I think that that's a verse as Americans we probably don't want to hear too often.
We should be heeding that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't, like the rest of this is it's specifying for the Edomites, but this one he actually says, and by the way, all nations, anything you do is going to do to somebody else. I know I said I'd stop talking about this, but I don't think I made a promise, so I'm going to go ahead and reference it one more time. But if you are interested in the fall of nations, this is something you see consistently. One of the things that leads to the downfall is the totalitarian and brutal way they deal with their enemies. And you can almost guarantee when a nation makes itself so unlikable that will come to bite it eventually. Now, in some cases, it takes a long time. Rome was making a lot of enemies for a long time, but it ultimately does sow the seeds of your own destruction. It is the thing that makes you get destroyed. That there's a lot of nations, middling, halfway nations that are not starting wars that have lived longer than some of these like civilizations we look to and go like, oh wow, that must have been an incredible time in this history. The reason we don't hear about them a lot though is they didn't really make a lot of enemies. You know, they just were trade partners. They existed and they got to continue to exist. You and I both read the Tao Te Ching together in your book club. Highly recommended, by the way, if you would like to join Aaron Goss's book club. It is excellent. We'll be reading again tomorrow. It'll be good. Rights of Man by Thomas Paine at the moment.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I took away from that was just this idea that we oftentimes think of safety as big army, more stuff, more violence. And yet when we look in world history, we actually find that like creating peace is a cheaper, easier, and more guaranteed way to be able to preserve your own nation. That when you start hoarding artifacts and collecting things and taking and sucking lifeblood from the other nations, it'll prop you up for a bit for sure, but it's also the exact thing that's going to lead to a downfall. It's putting a target on your head. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying America's going to fall. I think people get kind of eccentric about this. It's going to fall like tomorrow or something like that. But we are sowing the seeds of our destruction today when we do these things. And it's important to recognize what we're doing and that this is a biblical doctrine, that it will come back to destroy us, that ultimately we will have no friends that want to come to our defense. We would not win a world war against the entire rest of the planet. And we are dangerously close to seriously grieving basically every other nation on earth somehow. And that's really bad. Obviously, when we say it like that, we should also recognize it like that.
Well, and the thing that the United States needs to learn the most is if we get to a point where we're pissing off the entire rest of the world, we're also almost certainly to the point where we're going to piss off a plurality of people inside the country as well. So you're going to have internal conflict as well, because it's not like America's, united as Americans. Like a lot of us are very fed up with the actions of our government.
It's
considering we're both anarchists. I mean, it's a pretty good likelihood that we're included in that number.
Right. Right. And I think if you expand this to like people that are just dissatisfied with government, people that have given up voting or just vote to like for protection, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, ultimately, I think what we're doing is kind of deeply unpopular. I think a lot of people, if they even knew the horrors of war, or even let's not even just limit it to war, like the economic things that we do and the way we take advantage of other countries, it's really nightmarish. And I think we just need to kind of consider what it means to be a good neighbor and push for ourselves to run a nation in that way. I've often thought, I mean, if you were to take the money that we spend on defense, cut it in 10%, and say that much is actually for defense, and then take another 20% and then just be like, this is humanitarian aid. I mean, you would end homelessness in entire nations. You would feed entire regions. And can you really tell me, based on what you understand, like anybody, about like the terrorist attacks that happen? I mean, if you really wanted to actually end the war on terror, like that's what you would do. Right? Like, absolutely.
Can you imagine like if we took our military budget? Because I think if I remember the statistic, I think we spend more than the next 16 countries combined, and 14 of those are allies. Yeah. So like it's an absurd amount. If we cut our military budget by a massive margin and we spent that money developing nuclear reactors that can't be weaponized and using that money to build those nuclear reactors in third world countries with no strings attached at all, like with no you have to pay us back, or you have to be beholden to our, following American interests, like as a colony or anything like that.
Donated. Yeah.
Just straight up donating it. We would make the world so much a better place, and we would build so much goodwill among other nations. It would be incredible, but that doesn't appease Raytheon.
Right.
So we don't do it.
It's a perpetual cycle. And I actually, especially with Obadiah, don't mind getting deeply political when we talk about war, because I mean, This is the
What
whole
else is
thing,
there?
right? It's
Yeah, what
right.
else
It's
is there
political
to talk
war.
about in Obadiah? I keep feeling bad because I'm like, okay, this is a Bible study. This is not a
Yeah.
politics server. We need to
Yeah.
talk about the Bible, and I keep trying to mentally transition it back to Obadiah. But there's not much meat on the bones for Obadiah, so you kind of have to extrapolate it into modern analogies. And
Right.
I feel bad continually like sidetracking this, but at the same time, this feels like what Obadiah is about. Like
No.
it is
Yeah.
to us for the purpose of drawing wisdom from Obadiah. It's not about Edom and Israel because Edom and Israel are thousands of years ago at this point. This is about us and what messages can we draw from it with our modern day scenarios. And so that's why I keep getting
You're
brought back
right.
to this.
I think I've made the point personally as much as I can, right? Like that we are not just with our elderly, but we're tied to everybody, right? So just do right by everybody. Everybody who knows you should be blessed by you. I have said this before, and I will say it again, that if everybody's best friend is a Christian, Christianity wins. Like that's our best ticket to conversion. So focus on being a good friend to people and let your walk become the talk. We're told that Jesus spoke no scripture to people. He just did. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that sounds unbelievable, but like it literally is there in the Bible that he chose not to speak any scripture to people. He just told some stories and parables and then tended to their needs. Can you imagine if Christianity or America just decided to tend to people's needs and put messaging on the back burner for a little bit? Like, that's like, it feels uncomfortable because I think we're so message oriented, right? Like, as a Western society, we're just so message oriented. But the work is the message, right? Like, the healing is the message. Like, this is the
Can
gospel.
can you take a few minutes to talk about the recent post that you made about cathedrals? Because I thought it was beautiful. And I want
Yeah,
to hear you talk to your audience about that.
sure. So there's and I think many people in these circles have probably seen questions about why Christianity is not building, these big stone marvels anymore, and I've been to Europe. I was actually with an a cappella group for a bit, but I was also with a choir group. I have a respect for the cathedrals. I think it's amazing. I'd always heard about like resonance and like when a room sounds great when you sing. But when I sang in a cathedral and I sang a solo, it truly sounded like I was singing a duet. Like it really was that incredible. So I have a lot of respect for the frescoes and the art and everything like that. But there is this whole idea that like Western men in Christianity, like we're weak because we're not building these big cathedrals anymore. And what I said is we still build cathedrals. We build one every time we design technology that allows the deaf to hear or amputees to write. We build one every time we teach children to stop bullying and love one another. We build one every time we make food and water more accessible. We never stop building cathedrals. We just stop making large, cold structures to house ancient relics, false doctrines, and theocratic authoritarians. You may be right that the old cathedrals were more of a visual spectacle, but ask anybody who's had their family fed, their diseases cured, and their friends accepted by our new cathedrals if they are any less miraculous.
It was beautiful.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, but people love the live stream, so what can I do? Uh, yeah, and this is something that I think we should think more about is just this reaching out and being a good neighbor, and we worry that people aren't going to get the message of God if we don't brand it in the name of God or make it some type of crusade or put crosses all over it. I'll never forget, I was with Weird Libertarians and I was doing some prison outreach. And I was like, how do I draw more people to like the podcast group? How do I bring more people into that? And Chris was like, dude, do me a favor. Chris Spangle, shout out, buddy, love you, who is, the senior, founder, editor, godhead of Weird Libertarians, everything to Weird Libertarians. And he was like, do me a favor, don't. Just serve. Just do the service. And people will ask later. And it was so weird how if I had branded everything like Weird Libertarian stuff, people have been like, oh, thanks, cool, we're libertarians, that's nice. But when I removed the branding, people were like, why are you doing this? Like, tell me about yourself. What's going on? Like, tell me more about this. And I think if we removed all the iconography and the churches and the the doctrine and the Bible, and I'm not saying to remove obviously the concepts of the Bible, but I'm talking about like the physical books, and beating people over the head with it, that we'd be so much better off when we serve people. And I think that they would come to our conclusions a lot better. There was a study. It's bad. I quote it badly at this point, and I should need to look it up again. But people are like 5 times more likely. It's like 80% more likely, something like that. 5 times more likely to. No, it wasn't 80%. It was 5 times. That's right. It was 5 times more likely to become a libertarian if by getting out of financial debt than by reading a libertarian philosophy book. And I was just like, that's incredible, right? Like, that's such an incredible fact. And like that, if we were to feed somebody, they'd be much more likely to become Christians than if we told them about Jesus.
Yeah.
Astounding. But it's what we got to do. It's the message is there. We just got to follow up on it. People take this as an attack on the Gospels. I'm a left brain gospel lover. I went to school for it. I've learned Greek and Hebrew so that I can read the thing. I study with a rabbi to help me with this stuff. We have this Bible study every week, right? Or every other week, where we study a whole, book of the Bible. Like, I love the Bible. It's huge, a huge part of who I am. But even I am aware that when the Bible, if you love the Bible enough, the Bible itself tells you to put the Bible away for a moment and start doing some good works. And I think that's the point where you got to go, okay, if I actually do love this gospel, like I say I do, I actually need to have my behavior reflect that.
Faith without works.
Faith without works.
Yeah.
And people love to kind of be like, well, and it's like, that's in terms of salvation, right? But I mean, faith without works is dead, guys. It's dead to the world. If it's dead to God, it's definitely dead to the world. What good is it? Any thoughts you have on Edom before we close here? I know it's a little early and I'm not trying to rush it, but with only 21 verses to go on, there's not a lot of boxes to open here.
I feel like we've kind of exhausted it between what we talked about last time and this time. Yeah. But it was good.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good springboard for good conversation.
Yeah, it is. I think when we talk about the way the military industrial complex works is it's in a state of perpetual war because it needs to be in perpetual business. We based our entire economy off of the Keynesian economic identity equation, in that he concedes perpetual war. In fact, the people who protested against Keynes told him, they were like, this is going to be perpetual war. And he's like, yes, there will always be perpetual war with this system. So it's baked into the current economic system we have. Perpetual war is part of the deal. This isn't like an accident, that ever since we've adopted it, we've always been at war. Always. I think it's funny when we're ever not at war, we're droning the heck out of people. Like, we are at war. Believe me, you ask those people in other countries, we're at war. Like, whether we call it officially that or not.
Because there have been like 6 years of genuine peace in the last 200 something years.
Right. Yeah. Right. Like, since America's founding, right? Like 6 years that we haven't been involved in active combat. And so this is no accident, right? That war keeps happening and keeps coming up. And I think if you look at why this happens, and when we look at Obadiah and learn that lesson, we need to look at our current system and I have no problem making a national statement on this, because frankly, the Bible is talking about this in terms of a nation as well, that we can't be doing this. We just can't be behaving this way and expecting to be above it all the time. When we are bad neighbors to people, when we are, and I don't want to just say war, but like withholding goodness from people, when we're withholding what we can do. I worked with, he got murdered, and it's so sad, but I friends with a guy named Brett, and he founded Donor C. Donor C is a great, if you want I was always, the reason I found him is because I was always wary about donation companies that don't put your money where it needs to go. It's surprisingly hard to find one where the money goes where it needs to go. And this is one where it actually does. But during the COVID years, and Aaron, I'm sure you probably have heard of this, but when we shut off our industries and closed down businesses, that there were just whole cities in South America, Central America, Africa, even in Europe, that would just be like, okay, well, making the rubber for shoes was literally like our only thing. Like that's what we did. And now you're back. And now there's like, because of the shoes sales, company just goes, okay, we don't need you anymore. Like it's over.
Right.
I'm talking 100% of their money for food, shelter, water, anything you afford in life. And that's their whole tribe, their whole city, their whole town was based on making that. So when we cut back and we would just say, hey,
you just devastate them.
Devastated. No thought to them.
Yeah.
What thought had we of our neighbors when we did those things? We thought of ourselves. Sure, we did what Edom did. Thought of ourselves.
The thing is, like, you're talking about a third world country. We do that to Americans.
Yes.
Like, we do that to our own. Of course, we're going to do it to people we can't see. You know, like, you've got Nestle who does child slaves for cocoa right now. Or the Hershey's. And then you've got Nestle who's stealing like African countries' river water and everything like that, to the point where like we're like drying up rivers because we're over taxing them, to the point where you've got villages that are downstream that are like, there's no more water here. Like if we're doing those to third world nations, we're doing those to Americans, like with Flint and everything like that. Of course, we're going to do that to third world countries. And of course, you know, and talk nothing about like banana republics, like what you're talking about, where an entire nation, or, you know, in this case, I think you talked about a specific town, that have been entirely converted to being just a single part of an American product. Like not even the entirety of the product, but just like a part of it. You know, the soles of shoes or whatever.
Of course.
Yeah.
Pieces of cell phones. Yeah.
Yeah, pieces of cell phone. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is definitely not just a global problem. When we talk about, I'll give your book club another shout out here, but when we're talking about book gin, it's not that we shouldn't advance with energy. We should just do it with the understanding that it's like, hey, there are whole towns that are like, this is a coal town. This is everybody's money and livelihood. Let's not advance energy, but let's make sure these people are taken care of as we advance energy. Yeah. It's not, let's not get cars automated. It's, hey, if we make cars automated, let's make sure the people in those lines of work have a baton in between, right? These jobs. Let's make sure they're taken care of.
They're not just left twisting in the wind.
Correct, right? Yeah. Like let's have a it's conscious involvement. Right? Like, why do we want to, if you think about your DNA and the way it unconsciously evolves, it's always for the negative, right? Like you're getting cancers because of this. You get, you know, lymphomas and tumors because of all of it. But if you were to be able to consciously shape your DNA, of course you would be like, hey, let's take that aging stuff out. Let's do this. Now, as a society, we can't control our own DNA, we can control society structure. And so this is something we absolutely have the ability to conscientiously say, hey, let's make this advancement. Let's make sure these people are taken care of. Hey, we need people not getting sick. Also, let's make sure these people that, you know, if we're going to lock down a little bit, hey, are you guys going to be okay? Right? Like I don't need just like what they threw at us, like $500 or whatever. If we shut down your business, you know, here's $500 every 2 weeks. Sorry about your business. I guess we'll give you, if it was your business individually, we'll give you a huge loan, right? To be in huge trouble for. Like this was not taking care of anybody. Like it was really hurtful to everybody. Now, this does mean looking at economics at its core, because I mentioned the Keynesian system, it's baked in there, right? War is in there. According to the people who designed it, war is baked in there. He called it the consequences of the peace, for goodness sake, right? Like this is peace was a problem, you know? Yeah. So we need to really look at ourselves and consider the big changes that we need to make. As Christians, I'm going to call us to be radical on this one. We really got to, like, to avoid Edom's fate. The status quo is Edom's demise right now. So if you're just kind of trying to be like, well, maybe let's back off on a few things, as Christians, we got to back off on a lot. We got to change a lot of things about what we're doing right now if we are going to live the gospel and heed the warning that was given to not just Edom, but given to all nations in Obadiah. Aaron, anything you want to add before we get out of here?
No, you shouted out my book club twice, and I appreciate that. If anybody wants to join us, we're going to be continuing Thomas Paine's Rights of Man tomorrow, and we just started last week. We basically read the preface and a little bit into the beginning of it, so we're still very fresh into the book. If you wanted to join us, now's a great time. Just hit me up on Facebook, and I'll get you the invite.
Awesome. Aaron Goss, thank you very much. I'm Hody Johns. Again, we're the Love First Christians Bible Study. Any walk of life you're from, even if you kind of have some hard questions for Christians to ask and you're not a Christian yourself, we really welcome that in our study group. We'd really love you to join us. I have received so much contact from people who are like, saw this, love this. Please feel free to be a part of it. Like if you don't want to, that's fine. That's on you. I've been having a lot of like this last month, we probably had like 3 or 4 people like come to God because of conversations that we've been having. And I think it's funny because twice we've had this book club or not book club. We've had the Bible study kind of fall apart on us, but we've had people come to God because of like the conversations we've been having, but they kind of like aren't ready to join like a Christian group yet. It's no pressure. Again, there's no membership fee. I don't even have a bank account for this thing, right? Like this is a feeless thing. So if you're just listening and you're just like, boy, this is really cool. I'd love to have these conversations. Conservative, liberal, progressive, Republican, Democrat, Taoist, Buddhist. Heck, we have a Satanist. We have a hedonist, right? Like people that like you just want to join. We have, of course, chats for people that are all Christians. We have it, if you want a Christian-only chat group, but we have a chat group where we all just kind of have these Christ-centered conversations and really these love-first-centered conversations. And if that sounds like something that you are interested in, I just encourage you to join. Really appreciate everything that everybody's been doing, just the conversations we have every week and how positive we keep it. Everybody who's listening, thank you so much. It's always promising to me when the viewership picks up and up and up and up as the stream goes and we don't get people dropping off. And I appreciate you having the patience. Next week, we're going to discuss redemption as a Christian value, and it should be a lot of fun. We hope you are a part of that conversation. Aaron, I'll talk to you later. Everybody else, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you again. Bye.
Good night.